Welcome everyone to this week's show. It's going to be one of our best shows yet. And as always, we're here to bring you the trials and tribulations, collaborations and automations from the world of DevOps and the greater developer experience. Today, our guest is Arvinder Singh, a startup CTO, founder, an educator. And we first met at 500 Startups in San Francisco when he was building a startup called UrbanLogiq. Arvinder, it's great to see you again. Welcome to the show. How's it going?
Thank you, Tristan. It's great to be on the show, and Kyle, hello as well. Yeah, it's doing as well as I can. I'm doing doing a lot better than the first few weeks of quarantine. I think we've all gotten into the rhythms of it, but doing well. How about yourself?
Amazing. I'm doing great. I'm hopefully not too much into the middle of the yard, as I just immediately as we started, someone started mowing their lawn. But welcome to COVID and welcome to our work from home days that we live. So you just posted some really interesting stuff in the community. So let's jump there quick and kick it off. So here, you posted a few articles, but maybe we start a little bit on the latest Tweetstorm that you had about the Sikh hashtag. I'm really interested to hear more about this. And, this is one of those many things where, more inclusive products can be built by more diverse teams and can catch, and especially cross-country collaboration. And so tell me a little bit more about what you discovered and what happened.
Yeah, so just to give a little bit of background to that, the last company that I co-founded with, three other co-founders, this was, about 5 years ago, yeah, 4.5 years ago, and that's, and it was one of the 500 startups company, UrbanLogiq, and that's where we met first time. It was a data company. What we used to do, we used to take, data that, different forms of government generate and data that is all around us, and the insights that can be found within the data. So I think, when we were building that, I became acutely aware of, the usage of data, the power of data, but also I think the other thing that usually gets ignored is the bias that is within the data. And I think it becomes a lot more relevant given the, the Black Lives Matters movement and everything that is happening in the news. So this particular incident happened, every year in June, we celebrate, Sikh Kalukara Divas, which is, in 1984, June of 1984, there was the Indian Army stormed one of the core Sikh Gurudwaras in India and, used army against its own citizens. And it is, every year the Sikh community holds it as a time of reflection and as a time of one of the things that Sikh community does in Canada, for example, we do blood donation camps in the memory of those 1984, and it's one of the largest blood donation camps that happens in Canada. So during that time, the Sikh hashtag, because a lot of people post about the questions that lingered on, and some of the issues related to that was the justice that was not served. After that, there weren't many commissions that were set up. So the Sikh hashtag was used. Interestingly, during this time, the Sikh hashtag was blocked on both Instagram and Facebook. And it came into the notice of the Sikh community. And, there were a lot of theories that started to go around. And coming from, the data background, I started to explore a little bit more about it. And it went to how content is, moderated and what is the impact of that content moderation on the minority voices. And so if I go a little bit further into that, in all of this, either way, the news that is given out, the information that comes out, usually has some sort of bias, and typically is the editorial bias, usually set up by editors. And there's also power biases that come along with it. Who controls the news corporations, for example, You have all sides of the spectrum. For example, MSNBC is going to be very far liberal. Fox News is going to be very far right. But the social media always was intended to be a sort of a liberator of people's voice. And when you have situations like this where a large number of people could report a particular tag, and the machine learning algorithms take that as an input and automatically block a certain keywords around a certain time frame, that is sort of a new way of suppression of voices. And that is exactly what happened. And I tried to decode some of it, and the human component of it, and also the bias component, the algorithm bias, which is a huge topic of research within the machine learning community. So I posted that as as an explanation, and I was very surprised that it took up it got retweeted like hundreds of times. And
yeah, you got a lot of interest on it.
Yeah, last time I checked, it was seen more than 50,000 times.
Wow.
Yeah, it was an interesting one.
So I just, maybe let me unpack this a little bit. So as I understand this then, as you're describing it, sort of we have this user-driven input in Facebook and Instagram. There's an algorithm running on the back end, perhaps some people moderation that we've heard a lot about, that's curating certain types of content that is or isn't appropriate. We've heard about fact checking and these sorts of things. Was the premise that it was blocked not on input? You could input the Sikh tag. It was how that was distributed and moderated within the constraints of the algorithm and perhaps even the people moderation model on the back end?
So there are multiple components of it, the way I understand it. So Verge, for example, did an article on the Facebook moderation and I think Facebook has around more than 15,000 employees that primarily their job is moderation. Sometimes in social media, all sorts of social media networks, all sorts of images and videos do get uploaded, right? I think it starts with human moderation until it becomes sort of non-scalable for human moderation. That's where machine learning algorithms kind of jump in.
Mm-hmm.
But the issue there is one, if I think the mixed model works in a way where certain number of people report a certain tag, then it becomes triggered for moderation. Now the question becomes, who are the moderators, right? Moderators themselves are humans that are going to have their own biases as well, right? So I think the example that I gave there was when you have a fairly distributed, topic of moderation. For example, are people aligning with liberal, think tanks, or are people aligning with, conservative think tanks? It typically gets, somewhat balanced out, right? You have, either 40-50 or somewhat that kind of divide. But when you have very minority voices, right? They may be ethnic minority, they may be minority due to sexual orientation, they may be minority due to certain native choices, or any kind of minority voices where the representation is very less. Then I think it becomes problematic, because then even the moderators are going to flag something which may be offensive to a certain community as unoffensive. And I've seen that happen in certain cases myself, where certain kind of information was very derogatory. When I reported it to Facebook as well, it was moderated as it was okay with the community standards. The problem that happens is now that information is going to feed into the feedback loop of the algorithm that is learning from that moderation process.
Yeah.
And if that minority voice is very small, then it is going to become exponentially pretty quickly, which might be difficult to break down the line.
Yeah, I kind of I'm a simple person over here. So, I mean, I like to use analogies. I think of the whole, when you train an animal, let's say a dog, it exhibits the same good, but also the bad behaviors often of the person who trains it. So you're just reinforcing, especially if there's a minority set of views. When you look at this, it's like, it's such a complicated thing, because on one hand you say, okay, well, the origin of this was free market voice. Anybody should have a voice, and that voice should be equally distributed as it is truly represented in the community. On the other side, you have curation content algorithms to try to, I guess, in some ways better align you with the message that you already want to see. And that's maybe where this really breaks down to a different set of problems. But then there's also the issue of just, creating safety, and because there's a lot of voices out there that, can be challenging to listen to. How do you think about that? I mean, just from my perspective, actually this company, we dealt with real estate data. And so it very much was about free market representation, but there was also a consortium of people who standardized what was, reasonable data that didn't have biases, but you could, you had to be very careful about how you talked about crime data and different things that had negative impact on, the machine that feeds the industry. I think bringing this back to social media, like, how do you think about that from a free market versus closed loop kind of system? Because I mean, you kind of have to have both components. How do we kind of get that right from a data perspective based on your background?
Yeah, I think, I don't think, anyone has an answer, neither do I. But these are interesting problems happening. I think, one of the things that happened, my background, I worked in a media house within a university for a few years. And it was during the time that all of that, the journalism was going through this complete change, and a lot of the newspapers were failing. Now, in a less globalized world, you had information that was being distributed locally. So you had these, variety of information that existed in those small areas that influenced your daily lives. Now, with the whole globalization and, the social media networks having, they're large networks, there aren't many, small socialized networks, right? Everybody uses Facebook, everybody uses Instagram. So what has happened is that now those, the small bubbles have ballooned into those large bubbles. And now they are, geographically, they can be whichever, but they are more based on, the certain leanings. The question is like, how do you balance it? It's a tough one, right? I mean, Twitter, for example, uses this idea of, giving the blue ticks and basically saying, these voices are more influential. The question then becomes, which voices do you consider? What about the moderation of that process, right? I know that, we have seen certain cases where when Twitter is trying to go into a certain country, and it will favor, certain governments to give certain, certain authority to the voices, right? Or certain biases, that come with the government, and when our corporations are trying to work. So it's an interesting problem, right? What is the solution for it? I think one, there needs to be more representation. I've always been, huge advocate of, diversity within the teams. Even when, we were building our team for the last company, the very first, person that we hired for our team was, a woman, a minority. And then, as we started to grow our team, we had a very diverse team for the first 3 years or 4 years I was there. And I think part of it is, not hiring just for diversity, but basically saying, it is important to have, these very diverse voices. That is one. I think the other part is, I also think that, what we consider these as large platforms that are enabling people voices, I think there needs to still be, ethnic, local, smaller platforms, right? They may be country specific, or they might be language specific. Because otherwise what's going to happen is, people who are on the top of the People's Magazine are going to be the influentials, who drive almost, all sorts of, what is important. Like, think about this is happening within, our era, that, Kim Kardashian was able to influence, a president.
Yeah.
About a social, very a social issue. So it's interesting times, to say the least, right?
I think you've got it so right. Like you think about this, and we've globalized culture in some ways, right? Like, I think of this idea of intentional diversity versus intentional bias, and like, over modern history, people have always gravitated to people who have similar perspectives of them, because that's like your host, your family, your community. It makes you feel safe. We then polarize to this perspective of like, all culture is right there in the open and you have to amalgamate, which was great. We introduced diversity. Now what we're trying to figure out is, how do you balance it with this idea of intentional diversity, where you're challenging yourself to include perspectives that you wouldn't have otherwise seen, but you're also, you know, I guess not forcing a conversation on somebody who's just like not ready to have it. I guess like I really like the idea of people having like the systems that we create allowing you to choose what you subscribe to. I think that's good because it's kind of like the way the world was before all of the internet. But there has to be more of a push into this idea of intentional diversity, like looking and subscribing it and making it easy to. But these things just have a very challenging balance point on both ends of the system. And I don't think an algorithm gets it right, nor do I think humans curating it in a centralized way getting it right. So I have to go back to my, I guess, basically libertarian viewpoint that like an individual should be offered choice. But voices shouldn't, you know, the voices should be accessible, that they need to have that choice to pick from. And then it's, you know, about educating people on making that choice to broaden their horizons. I mean, that to me feels like the purest cycle in which we can get this conversation really like rolling in a way that balances both things.
Yeah, I think you said it right. I think, you know, it shouldn't be diversity or you know, amalgamation of voices shouldn't be forced. I mean, when it's forced, you know, it doesn't come out right.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that we practice, and maybe, you know, Tristan, you know, you might want to share your experience of traveling as well. I'll share two examples. Like one, I think in the beginning, when we started the company, we had an opportunity, you know, to, there was an accelerator that was happening in Dubai. We heard from them. It was a smart cities accelerator. And, you know, we never ended up pursuing that. We had certain biases. And at a later point of, you know, time during, I think it was third year or fourth year, we had an opportunity to attend a research conference in Qatar. And, you know, my business partner and we were sitting there, you know, in the middle of Qatar. There was a bazaar and in the middle of the night. And we, while experiencing it, we were like, all our perceptions of the place are just, you know, just broken, right? So I think traveling is one component. I think the other component, we also always had this idea within the team that everyone, you know, what is culture? So we used to talk about, you know, the when you're trying to bring in diversity, you have to create safe spaces, and you have to, you know, make sure that everybody, you know, kind of abides with the idea of empathy and respect. Whenever you know, you come across people who have different opinions, right? And sometimes, you know, those opinions might be, you know, at complete 180 degree to each other, right? As long as, you know, you understand that it's okay, there, you know, this is a safe space, you know, and there is nobody is trying to show everyone else down, and everybody has an opinion, right? And everybody, it doesn't mean you have to, you know, adapt that opinion, but, you know, it's important that people feel empowered to share what they believe, right? And I think creating those safe spaces, you know, within companies is, I think it's very essential in the globalized world where we're going to have very diverse population, very globalized kind of workforce. I think this idea of empathy and respect being integrated, ingrained again in within the cultures, I think that helps as well.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, there's something about that, bringing your authentic self to work, being able to do that, and trusting your employees, your company, to, that is okay for you to do. So I think there's something really important about that as well. And I think it's, you know, the next generation of workers coming online are going to feel even more bent in that direction. It's interesting having those conversations, being, you know, COVID and working from home, and talking to like our parents or grandparents, you know, or people in like the baby boomer generation, and how some actually have that opinion, like, actually you should live two lives. You know, you should live your work life and you should live your home life. And then, you know, talking to like my sister who's younger than me, and it's like completely the opposite perspective. It's like, I want to be who I am at work. I want to be who I am at home. You know, I want to be the same person. I'm not a different person. And so I think we're kind of getting into some of that conversation of, having the safe space. And, you know, we talked a little bit with Wesley Faulkner on the last episode about employee resource groups, you know, allowing people to organize around their cultural or background differences, and be able to then provide that unique voice to different aspects of the company and different business functions. And so, yeah, I think you're totally right. And I think experiential experiences, travel, different types of experiences, different types of cultural events. Something that you can do often in person, and at large scale, where hundreds or thousands of people may go to, even like a music festival, or there's just that you learn such a broad perspective from meeting people at these gathering points. And so now I guess also finding the right gathering points when we have to manage also this virus is its own challenge as well.
Right. Right. No, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think sometimes, even I think the advantage that you have when you're, when you build the culture right from the get-go of, hiring without bias, thinking, promoting diversity, is that you start to get some of those experiences within your team every day, right? The more diverse your teams are, I think the more are the chances of capturing so many different perception data points that it becomes, sort of an everyday thing, right? Versus if you have, let's say, just very homogeneous team, it may be for sexual orientation, or it may be, for race, or language, or things like those. So yeah, I think you're spot on. It's a lot of it comes with experience, and I don't think anybody has perfectly nailed it down, and I don't think anyone would be perfect in doing it. It's a sort of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of process.
It's very dynamic.
As long as,
it's very dynamic. Exactly. I think about it as you guys are talking. I'm thinking about it like going back to the machine learning algorithms that we're talking about in Facebook. More data inputs is generally good, but you need a reinforcement loop. What is that reinforcement loop? In my mind, it's been diversity with commitment. So diversity is the company leading first, saying here's a safe space. But then when you talk about festivals or travel, there's this shared commitment that everybody's kind of in it together. That also happens bottom up, which becomes that reinforcement loop of making sure that the best perspectives also, and sometimes that commitment is a commitment to disagree and commit, but ultimately what you're doing is you're broadening the amount of voices and creating reinforcement loops so that the best things rise to the surface. But that's not typically as problematic in a human scenario as it is at the kind of scale that these big systems are running in. So it's one of those things where I think it works really well in smaller circles, smaller ponds. Big splash, small pond is what I've always tried to think about with these things.
Yeah. I think I'll also share an interesting perspective from the Wikipedia. A lot of I think about if I'm a moderator and I'm trying to moderate or provide some decision around a certain data point, around a particular language or place or culture that I'm not completely familiar with, what would I refer to? I would refer to Wikipedia, right? That'll be my first point to go. Now, the biases within Wikipedia are huge, right? Because Wikipedia has also become a sort of a tool for spreading a certain information, and there are certain organizations or certain groups that can spend a lot more resources, or even the representation, right? So I completely agree with you that as we go towards this globalization, I think we have to still preserve some of that, smaller groups, and it's an interesting dynamic of how we open up, how we build these small groups, but we don't close them up. So there is still, conversation happening across groups, and how do we promote, I think that transfer of information. And I think as you guys, as all of us have been entrepreneurs, and, we tried, our aim is to build organizations that are large enough within a certain geography, but sometimes, we get to a point where we scale beyond those geographies. I think there's a lot of opportunity for startups and enterprises that, sometimes even governments don't have. Governments typically cater to, a certain country or a certain demographic or a certain, bias that comes embedded by being geographically locked, versus, companies themselves are not so. They're far more flexible as they grow to larger scales.
Sam Altman had a great tweet this week. I'll just share this. He said, what did he say? He said, independent thinking is becoming more valuable the less of it there is. And I thought it was a nice like one-liner that kind of just highlighted, why startups are valuable because of the independent thinking and pushing it, but also just in this broader conversation is independent thinking. Like if you can't rely on Wikipedia, right? You got to be able to think independently and have that conscious understanding of what the information that there it is. Sorry, I paraphrased. The willingness. Oh, that's even nicer. The ability, or more important, willingness. Yeah, that makes it even nicer.
It requires courage.
Yeah.
The ability I think sometimes people have, but again, will you willingly do it? And we saw that example of, taking decisions around, how the stand of Facebook and Twitter completely differed in last few days during the Black Lives Movements. Right?
How did it split? Actually, I wasn't aware of that.
So I think Twitter, I think it was around, marking the tweets of President Trump by Twitter as, certain saying that I think.
Promoting violence or being potentially unfactual, but still allowing access, but then kind of covering them with a modal or something.
Right. And I think Facebook's stand was to not do that. I think they reversed it.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
But I think it was interesting, right? It was interesting to see that dynamic play because, companies have to work with the governments, and companies have also to make sure that, all different sorts of voices are being heard, not just the popular opinion, right? And how do they strike that balance? And as a company, as a corporation, how much of is your responsibility towards your investors and the social good of the people? Those are two sometimes can be very competing things.
Yeah.
Right? So I think it's
I've heard this statement of what was it, like multi-stakeholder instead of just shareholder, and thinking about how your business impacts everyone that no matter if it's on the logistics chain or they're an employee or a customer or that greater community, and just considering all that impact on everyone that you have an interaction with.
Right. And I think we have, I've been in the past since the pandemic started, I've been doing self-reflection. I've also been reading. I like history, a little bit of philosophy, and within the Sikh paradigms, there is this concept of sarbat, right? And the idea of sarbat is that whenever it gets invoked quite a bit, within Sikh paradigms, and the idea of sarbat is everyone, right? And it includes it includes not just people, it includes environment, it includes, so even the definition of the God within the idea of Sikhism is Ek Onkar, which basically means there is just one, right? And if there is just one, that means that the idea of sarvat, that everything is not disconnected from you. You're just part of this one big thing. And if you start to think about that way, then you start to the responsibilities that you have towards other people, even people who are competing with you, the responsibilities you have towards the environment, the responsibilities that you have towards the earth, the place we call home, the responsibilities that you have towards the communities that we live in, our customers, and the all different kind of voices and diversity in the voices. I think that comes very naturally then. I think in this era of competition, it's very easy to start getting focused on, we are building this company and we are competing with the world, right? And sometimes to lose that foresight of why are we doing this? If it's the whole, it's the collective whole. And I think the idea in terms of one of my mentors usually talks about what is the way to build a successful company, and the idea is to solve actually human problem, right? To eliminate human pain, and if you're doing it right, I think that is how you build successful companies. So I think it's very interesting how some of the things that we want to look for the future can sometimes come from the past.
That's deep.
Yes.
That's deep, especially as I think about that against my own experiences, Western culture, just how fiercely independent many Western cultures are, and you can really see the differences and how something like that can be needed, and that's deep. You hit me hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it always brings me back to Sapiens when you kind of look. I feel like that the author there loves that, like, let's go back and learn from everything before then we can actually move forward. And
Right.
I love that timeline approach, because there is so much you can learn. It's not that it's irrelevant, and we are still all humans and still thinking the same way. We're not to that Homo Deus yet, where we've modified ourselves enough. We're actually very, very similar, trying to live in a totally different environment.
Whoa,
Right.
Homo Deus. Unpack this for me. I don't have this deep.
The Homo Deus is the follow-up to Sapiens, where
Okay.
he then starts Sapiens kind of gives you that, like, I don't know, 10,000 years, post-agriculture evolution, and then Homo Deus goes into this. We will not be Homo sapiens at some point anymore. We'll have either too much modifications, either with data or robotically. We might have nanorobotics in our brains. Like we will get it to a point where we won't actually be able to qualify as a true Homo sapien anymore.
Wow.
And so that's kind of what the second follow-up that he gets into.
Who's he, and where is this from? I'd like to read this sometime.
Yeah, let's pull it up.
Let's pull that link out, because there's people already talking about this, like just this, and like this is like it's almost an extension of you already. So like maybe we're almost there, right, with the internet. So okay.
Yeah, it's Yuval Harari.
Wow. A Brief History of Tomorrow. I want to read this, but I think it's gonna scare me.
It's a really helpful read. I love Sapiens. He just has a great perspective on helping you take a step out of your current environment and look back on what is, like, where have we come from? What is the global culture? What are we living in? And help you have those realizations so that you can take a step out and be more unbiased and be more objective and start. It really helped me even take critical thinking to another level, because there's a lot of things that you grow up in your own culture, in your own country, in your own community, that you don't always realize. And he starts to look at how things have come together as a global culture. And overall, there's a lot of things that still occur that may seem that progress is inhibited, but if you look at the long scheme of things, we're actually progressing quite quickly and quite rapidly, and it's usually moving forward to a bit more positive place. And we're adapting this global culture, which then also means it's much harder to change a global culture. So that might also be indicative of why it does take really large movements to change things, because it's not just one country or one community thing anymore. It's everyone is getting exposed to a lot of the same things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No,
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to comment and say it's incredibly obvious how you could see this sorts of philosophy, ideology, and open to these ideas, how you could see that permeating in to the technology that we build and use every day, by making it something that you absorb and bringing it into your perspective as you're writing that next software system, right?
Yeah, some years ago I read Martin Heidegger, and he has an essay. I think it's called On Technology. I think it's called something like that. And he was he wrote that essay, I think, beginning of the last century, and it's an interesting thought process. He basically says, we basically do innovation. We develop technology to move our life towards a certain direction, and as we move towards a certain direction, and it makes our life easy, there comes a certain point where the technology actually starts nudging our path towards certain way, right? So I think so. Just the people who are usually developing the technology, they have to be very cognizant of the idea which way they are being nudged, right? There are multiple examples within our history where you can look at, for example, the advent of nuclear nuclear fusion, right? And which direction to take from there, or how we develop fossil fuel, and what were the impacts, right? I think there was a time where like all of the scientific community was saying that lead was just fine. There was no issue of lead being within. They make car more efficient, so it was better for the economy. It was people could travel places, right? But then how does, and I think I always go back now, especially when I started to think about this idea of sarbat, an idea of this one, is that how much of it I'm taking from it, and how much of it are we building this whole, right? And I think a lot of the problems that you even see within even the racial issues or injustice, or where we have strong biases, can be as we start to go into this idea of this oneness, can be addressed very quickly, because then you start to think, okay, a person who's a different color or a different upbringing or a different background is no different from me. And what I'm spending my life, what is the legacy I'm leaving towards building the kind of things that I want to build, because eventually we will all perish away, right? Is how does it add to that sarbat, right? While still giving you a piece of whatever you wanted to attain with your.
Yeah, I like that. You'll have to send me a link to that after. I'd love to throw that in our link drop, and I do appreciate that oneness. And I even had this thought the other day. It's like the whole like you are what you eat, right? And like everything, right? Is always being processed back through and becoming a little bit of you, and supporting this continuation of life on Earth. And it's just nice to be able to step back and think of that. And I think, like you were saying earlier, within work from home days, now everyone's had more time to reflect and think about some of these things, and just as a matter of changing perspective. And you mentioned that earlier too, just the perspective, being able to have people with different perspectives. The clearest outcome is that there are going to be things uncovered, and I think that's just the the long and short of it. Well, Arvinder, it's been a pleasure. That was really, I think I think I'm all in on the sarbat, and thanks for coming on. Any other thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think we were going to go in a different direction. We thought about talking about starting up the technology, and doing the startup and making those choices and moving that. But I think maybe we can do that another time. But I think some of these issues are important, especially now. Since I leaving, so I ran UrbanLogiq as a CTO for about 4 years, a little less than 4 years, and then took a brief pause to just explore things that I was sort of burnt out. But I work a lot. So I started a nonprofit where I work with international students who have come here as fresh students and immigrants. And I see, every day I hear about the cases about struggle, right? When you're making the choices about career, when you're making the choices about starting something, or just dealing with the pandemic and dealing with everyday fights and fires. And I think in the world of startup, where we are having billion-dollar valuations around us, sometimes it's easy to lose the sight of where we're going. And I think so. I think these questions are important. I think the COVID-19 was a good time to kind of sit back and reflect on what do I want, personally for me, what do I want to do next, and what do I want to build next, right? And it definitely is going to be more towards, does it include everyone? Does it include the idea of self?
I like it.
That's
Where
great.
can we take a look at what you're working on now? Is there a website up now? Can we drop that in there as well?
Yeah. So I have my personal website, arvindkang.com. I've been mostly keeping it under the wraps for now, but
Cool.
I think any announcement I'll do it on the on the website. I'll send you the link.
Yeah, send us the link. We'll share it around for sure. We'd love to. Awesome.
Well, with that, I think we're coming to a conclusion of another episode of the Ops Show. Thank you, Arvinder. We will hopefully have you back on the show, and we can go even more into the scaling a startup and all the things that go into being a technical leader on that side of the planet. And Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Welcome, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much, Tristan. And yeah, I've been, I met you years ago, but I've been following your journey. It's a very interesting journey. And Kyle, so great to meet you. And finally, when this is over, we'll probably get together, have a cup of coffee together.
Absolutely, and I'm glad we have like 3 or 4 or maybe 5 other topics left to discuss. I really was excited and looking forward to getting into some of those as well. So can't wait for that coffee.